We've made it this far into the week. It is Friday. I want to say Friday, but if you're in Indy or Cincinnati, it's pretty rainy, pretty windy. At least where I'm at in Cincy, it's rainy. For Andrew in Indy, it's rainy, although not as rainy, I think, if you look at the forecast. But Andrew's the cool kid because he's still in Indy. He's still at the Combine, and he's got some great stuff to talk about. And I'm not as cool, so I'm just back in Cincinnati putting this thing together. But we're going to have some fun. Welcome into another NFL Combine offseason edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast. Muhammad Ahmad and Andrew Gillis here with you. Mike Neislick has a day off going into the weekend, as him and I talked about a lot of stuff on Thursday that I want to get you involved into, Andrew. But, of course, the big talk today amongst the position groups came from the tight ends. The tight ends spoke today. I also believe quarterbacks and wide receivers spoke. The quarterbacks and wide receivers I don't think are much of an area to talk about because that doesn't concern the Bengals, but tight end, I want to absolutely start there. And we'll get to some of the other position groups as well that performed yesterday in the actual workouts and will perform later Friday and Saturday. But, you know, looking at the list, Andrew, it seems like Dalton Kincaid from Utah, Michael Mayer, of course, who we've mentioned over and over again, the Kentucky kid, Cincinnati kid, if you want to say that, you know, NKY, whatever. Sam Laporta from Iowa. Those guys have all talked to, and Darnell Washington from Georgia, I don't want to leave him out. All four of those guys have talked to the Bengals. They talked about it at the podium today. You know, one thing that stood out to me, Andrew, that I want to talk to you about is, you know, Michael Mayer, of course, was asked about what would it be like to be a Bengal? What would it be like to be in Cincinnati? And he was like, I grew up 15 minutes from Houday Stadium. He said Houday Stadium, which I thought was great because he obviously grew up a Bengals fan. He talked about wanting to have Joe Burrow throw him the ball. Just starting there with the tight ends, Andrew, when you look at someone like Michael Mayer, what impressed you about him today? And, you know, what did you kind of take away from what he talked about? And where do you think this could go for the Bengals? Like, does this actually make the Michael Mayer hype even more realistic?
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, it's pretty clear that the Bengals aspect of this really mattered to him. You know, the way that these interviews work for the uninitiated is, you know, you have a lot of people there. Have you met with the Packers? Have you met with the Steelers? No prospect is ever going to say, yeah, that meeting sucked. You know, everybody's respectful. Everybody's talking about their versatility. Everybody's, you know, it's pretty cookie cutter. And then Michael got asked about potentially playing with Joe Burrow in Cincinnati, and you could sense a shift. His face lit up. He got very, very excited to talk about the Bengals and kind of talk about what it would mean for him. So, I mean, it was pretty clear that it matters. You know, that, you know, he was very, very excited to talk about, you know, the history of the Bengals. You know, he mentioned, you know, he got asked about, you know, some of his earliest football memories. And he was like, man, you know, when I was growing up and I just got to see Chad Johnson and Ocho Cinco and TJ Hushmanzada, and like he got to see all of those guys just having fun. That was kind of what stuck out to him. So, you know, he's got a Bengals background. So that's obviously, you know, the tie-in for the Bengals right there. But from an on-field perspective and kind of what he thinks he can bring on the field, he was extremely confident today. He got asked to compare himself to somebody. He said Travis Kelce. You know, somebody asked him what the most underrated part of his game is, and he said, nothing's underrated about my game. They asked him, you know, somebody asked him about, you know, kind of what happened from Notre Dame and, you know, what he can take away from that school. And he said, look, my greatest takeaway is my leadership. We started 0-2 this year with a loss to Ohio State and Marshall. And we were like, all right, what do we need to change? And we turned things around. So he is an extremely confident dude. It's hard not to be impressed by Mayer, both, I mean, as a player and as just as a person. So you have to feel good about kind of where you're at with him. He said he had met with the Bengals. So it's, I think, obviously we kind of knew that, you know, Mayer was on the radar, and today kind of confirmed that, I think.
So, Andrew, you said a lot of interesting stuff, and, you know, you kind of talk about how just impressed you were. I'm very impressed with Michael Mayer just from hearing what he said and kind of hearing the impressions you talked about. Let's just do my hypothetical, because, of course, we only assume this, assuming things go a certain way in free agency, right? Because if they're going to get a tight end in the first round, this has to happen, which is that, you know, you don't keep – well, let me put it like this. Maybe you do keep Hayden Hurst, and you do keep Mitchell Wilcox, but Drew Sample walks. And maybe, although you're going to have Hayden Hurst, you don't know how long he's going to be there. Maybe it's another short-term deal. So Hayden Hurst, in this hypothetical I'm laying out, is either not back in Cincinnati or he's back, but it's another short-term deal, even if you have Mitchell Wilcox back, where in this case I don't think you have a Drew Sample, and I think he walks regardless of what happens. But if all that happens, and the Bengals, again, offensive line is a concern. We're going to get to that later in the show. But if Michael Mayer's on that board at 28, you have Hayden Hurst, but you don't have Drew Sample, so you need a tight end for depth. Would you feel comfortable going for Michael Mayer at that point?
I would. I've made this kind of case before, both on the podcast and both just, in talking to you guys and talking to other people. I think when you look at Michael Mayer, I don't think you really have to worry about the kind of production that you're going to get. I think it's pretty clear that he's going to be at least a solid NFL player. The reason, a lot of people might like a Darnell Washington or a Dalton Kincaid or somebody like that is, you might find more value in the receiving aspect. But, with Mayer, I think you have to feel confident that what you're going to get is a multi-year pro, somebody who's going to come in and do a bang-up job for you. I'm not saying he's going to be, maybe one of the league's elite tight ends. I don't know if he's going to jump into that Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce kind of mold. I just think that that's so hard to jump into. But I think he's going to be a really solid player. The only thing to me would be who else is there. Is Mayer is like, how do you compare Mayer to an offensive lineman? How do you compare him to like an Anton Harrison, or does insert defensive back here fall? There's a couple different guys that you can kind of make cases for at 28. But I think if Mayer's there at 28 and the Bengals pick him, I don't know. Really how you could be terribly upset with that pick.
And the beautiful thing, like I talked about earlier in the podcast, is, Duke Tobin, Bengals Director of Player Personnel, said that number 28 pick is so flexible, whether it's a Michael Mayer or an offensive tackle, or maybe, and I want to pivot to this in a little bit, but just to kind of give you an idea of where I'm going with this, you could maybe go for corner. But before we even talk about that position, before I jump the gun, you mentioned Darnell Washington, Dalton Kincaid. I mean, you also have Josh Wild, the UC kid. We talked about him when we were doing our tight end reviews and mentioning possible fits if the Bengals don't get like a Michael Mayer or a Dalton Kincaid, or any of those top-tier tight ends. That's a name I think that's very interesting. Kind of talk to me, Andrew. Like when you look at Darnell Washington, Dalton Kincaid, and Sam Laporta, those three, I want to kind of zoom in on those three specifically. What do you like about them? Obviously, they met with the Bengals, and so I'd imagine the Bengals are very impressed and or interested in them. What did you like about those guys from talking to them today? And, where do you think they could fit in the grand scheme of things, even if maybe the Bengals don't go for that in the first round? Like maybe, they go for that in the second or third round. What do you make of what those three guys could bring?
And it was Kincaid, and who were the other two?
Oh, I'm sorry, my mic cut out for a second there, Andrew. I was saying Dalton Kincaid and Sam Laporta and Darnell Washington. I like to call those guys the big three outside of Mayer, if that makes sense.
No, I think that's doing a little bit of a disservice to Luke Musgrave too, the tight end out of Oregon State. I think the thing with Dalton Kincaid and with Darnell Washington, specifically with Washington, you're drafting a guy who is 6'7", 270 pounds, and can move. So if you draft a Darnell Washington, you're doing that in order to get a guy who, okay, we think this guy can be an athletic monster for us here over the next handful of years. You're kind of shooting for upside there. Obviously, he was not a starter at Georgia because you have one of the best tight ends in college football, maybe the best tight end in college football, in Brock Bowers. So you've got you're kind of betting on athleticism there with Washington, although what he showed you was pretty impressive. Dalton Kincaid was the only other tight end group I was in terms of a media scrum. You got kind of the same vibe from him. He was a pretty confident guy. I think the word of the week is versatility from people. Everybody likes to talk about how they're versatile. They can play inline tight end. They can play in the slot. They can do a lot of different stuff. And he kind of honed in on that. Dalton Kincaid, he's 6'4", 240. So you're getting a little bit of a smaller player than Mayer. Mayer's 25 pounds heavier. So, Kincaid is more of a receiving threat. which I'm curious to see how the Bengals look at these tight ends, considering you might need somebody who's, maybe a little bit better of a blocker, especially if you're going to have some problems at tackle. And then Sam Laporta, I think that's, I think you're going to get a typical Iowa tight end out of him. He's a solid player. You're not really going to get a ton of, how do I put this? I don't mean this in a negative way. I don't think his receiving upside is as high as like a Mayer or a Washington or a Kincaid. He had 2 pretty good years at Iowa. But I just think that you're kind of getting, he's going to be the guy if the Bengals don't draft a guy in the first round, second round at tight end. He's the guy you're looking at in those middle rounds to come in and kind of fill a role for you.
And you're saying that would be Kincaid? Is that who we're talking about?
No, that would be Laporta. Sorry. So if you're going to pick Kincaid,
Laporta, okay,
you're probably going to have to pick Kincaid or Washington. You're probably Kincaid, Washington, Mayer, or probably even Musgrave. You're probably going to have to pick them in rounds 1 or 2. And but with Laporta, I think you can wait a little bit.
I like how you kind of ranked that order there, and I'm so glad you laid that out because I think it gives people listening and honestly even me kind of some clarity of like, okay, where do the Bengals pursue a tight end, and in what order do you pursue those tight ends from, Michael Mayer to Laporta or whatever order you want to make? I don't know that I really disagree with any of that. I think you're really spot on there, Andrew. But there is one thing I think that's an interesting debate because I've seen this kind of on Twitter. I thought about this a lot, and Mike Nizick and I talked about this on Thursday, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, which is that I talked to a lot of the cornerbacks yesterday. I talked to a Clark Phillips from Utah, Emmanuel Forbes from Mississippi State. I mean, both of those guys were just filthy. I mean, like the way they played last year, as much as they're both different guys, one is taller than the other, and, the taller one would be Forbes. They're both really nasty ball defenders. And I'm not saying that to be cliche. Like, that's really what they are. It's just they're really good in coverage. Now, as far as like run defense and versatility, I don't know if that's their strongest suits, which is maybe why they're those middle tier, cornerbacks. I think, PFF and most boards have them second, third round. But you're so deep there because before that, you have Joey Porter, Jr., I should say, because that's Joey Porter's son, Joey Porter Jr., Devin Witherspoon. I know you had your interesting take on what to do if Devin Witherspoon is available at some point in the first round. But, Andrew, I mean, as deep as tight end is, and we're not saying it's not, and as deep as cornerback is, if you're at 28 and, like I said, you do have a Hayden Hurst, you do have Mitchell Wilcox, and Michael Mayer's not on the board. Like, maybe he goes to Jacksonville, whether or not they bring back Evan Ingram. He's off the board, but you can still get to Washington, Kincaid, Laporta later. Do you go for a cornerback in that first round? And, of course, I want to add to the hypothetical, Eli Apple and Trey Flowers don't come back to Cincinnati in free agency. With that hypothetical in mind, is it unrealistic or realistic to consider, a cornerback at 28?
No, I don't think. I think the craziest thing is, I mentioned this. I don't even know what day it was. The first day we did our podcast. This week is very long week, but it was whatever day we were talking about. Kind of I think it was Tuesday. We were kind of going through options here, and I think the Bengals have kind of positioned themselves nicely, and you really do see the benefits because there are a lot of drawbacks. And I wrote about this earlier in the week. There are a lot of drawbacks to having a quarterback that is going to make a lot of money here very, very soon. But with that in mind, where you stand. You have the quarterbacks. You have the quarterback solved. You don't have to worry about moving mountains to try and move up and get one. And with the Bengals as a roster right now, I mean, how many picks could they make that you look at and go, man, that's a really bad pick? What if Von Bell leaves in free agency? I could absolutely see them looking at the safety market. If you draft a linebacker, I don't know if that would be the best pick in the world. Just kind of knowing the guys in this class at 28, and also kind of looking at positional value. But I mean, you could see that. You could see really anything along the board. So I've said this before. You need as many defensive backs as possible. You could look at a guy like Akili Ringo, Clark Phillips from Utah. You can start to kind of convince yourself of a lot of different things. You could wait. I mentioned on our podcast before, Julius Brents, that kid out of Kansas State, 6'4", really long and can fly. So there's options, I think, in the first 2 rounds for you at cornerback that, again, You're talking about a team that you have Chidobe Awuzie coming off an ACL. Mike Hilton's nearing 30. Again, I think you need some youth at that position. Typically, you would think that would be depth, but if you're gonna draft a starter, I mean, I don't know how you could complain about that.
Yeah, I mean and again, it all goes back to that word flexibility, as cliche and overused as it might be. I mean, they aren't such an interesting position. I mean, this is why I think. Not just in the last decade, but like in the turn of the century. So basically, since the Paul Brown Stadium era, if you want to call it that, this is going to be the most uniquely challenging draft that the Bengals have had since the turn of the century. Because, like I said, like you said, Andrew, it's different when you've got Joe Burrow in his situation, and it's different when you've got guys like, T. Higgins and Logan Wilson who can get paid. Like, the Bengals are in just such a unique position that they've never really been in, just because they've never been this kind of a championship contending team. Like, because they're such a contending team, and this is a point that Mike made yesterday, which is that you're trying to win the Super Bowl. You don't want to draft certain projects. You don't want to draft certain guys that you hope will be good. I know you mentioned depth, but for the most part, you want to get guys who can go and win now. And that's why I think it's so interesting when we talk about that 28th overall pick, because it's like, oh, you need an offensive tackle. You got to protect Joe Burrow. But it's like, well, what if you don't have Eli Apple and you don't have Trey Flowers, but you have Hayden Hurst? Like, maybe you don't need a tight end or a tackle at that point, because you've got cornerbacks who could do better than what Eli Apple did, better than what, Trey Flowers did in the slot. As much as I've kind of been critical of him, there's so much you can take out of that. But when we come back, I want to talk about some players that I mentioned yesterday who could and maybe should be restructured, not named Joe Mixon, and we revisit the frustrations with the offensive line, which is nothing new in Cincinnati. I'll tell you why it's not anything new when we return on the Strictly Stripes podcast. And thanks for staying with us on the Strictly Stripes podcast. So for our listeners who tuned in Thursday, this might be repetitive, but Andrew, I want to get your thoughts on this because I talked to Mike about this. But when you hear the word restructure and, cap casualty, the name that keeps coming to mind for the Bengals, of course, unsurprisingly, is Joe Mixon. You could say Lyle Collins too, but that's not a guy you restructure. If you cut him, you cut him. With Mixon, there's a possibility of restructuring his deal because he's got 2 years left on his current $48 million extension. So if you are in a situation where, again, you're paying Joe Burrow, you need to make some cap space. This is also hypothetical because we don't know what Duke Tobin and Mike Brown and, Katie Blackburn, we don't know what they're going to pay Joe Burrow, what that deal's going to look like. But let's say you're in a situation where you need some space. You need some room. You need some money. You need some dough. You know what I'm saying? We can call it whatever we want. At that point, I think the Mixon talk is still real. But tell me if I'm crazy for thinking this, Andrew. Is it unrealistic to assume the possibility of restructuring Tyler Boyd's deal, restructuring Trey Hendrickson, like those other big cap casualties that maybe you can work around? Are those guys that you could restructure, like if you needed to, or is that maybe asking for too much if you're the Bengals front office?
I think it's an interesting question. I think Mixon would be the guy that you try to restructure. If you cut him going into 2023 pre June 1st, it's going to cost you $5.5 million in dead money. You're going to save 7.2 against the cap. But I think if you're talking about a guy whose cap number is $12.7 million, that's not insignificant. I don't know. I don't think you can really restructure Tyler Boyd unless it comes with a contract extension. I'm not really sure what you would do in that regard. It'd be a lot easier to do a contract restructuring with Joe Mixon because he's got 2 years left on his deal, and Trey Hendrickson, who also has 2 years left on his deal. And if you kind of look at the dead money with Trey Hendrickson going into 2024. $2.5 million in dead money and a $15 million cap savings if he's a pre-June 1st cut. So if the Bengals really thought that they needed an upgraded pass rusher and needed to save some money, that'd be the place to do it. But I'm not sure you just want to let go of a guy like Trey Hendrickson. So to me, if you're going to do anything with a restructuring, it's got to be with Joe Mixon. I wouldn't be surprised if you extend Tyler Boyd because you kind of look at where this offense is headed. You got Jamar Chase that's going to make a big contract. And even if you do get rid of T. Higgins, I mean, you can absolutely do a nice deal for Jamar Chase and then a contract for Tyler Boyd, and that's not really going to kill you. So I think you can find another number 2 in the draft and kind of pair him with Jamar Chase. So to me, I think that I wouldn't be surprised if they extend Tyler Boyd this offseason. But again, you got to win the Super Bowl now. So whatever moves you have to make to do that, I think that's what they're going to do.
I like how you phrase that. Like, I think, if you're going to keep Tyler Boyd, maybe you extend him, but you spread that cash out where the cap space is a little more breathable in a situation like that. Hendrickson is just tough because he's making so much money and he's got 2 years left. I think after next year, you can – let's say next year he literally does worse than he did this year last year. I'm just assuming this. If that's the case and you're going into an offseason next year, yeah, you can actually talk about him the way we're talking about Joe Mixon or the way that we're talking about La'el Collins because it's just cutthroat. The NFL is just really cutthroat. You could have a guy who was a Pro Bowler who broke records like he did in 2021 when, it was his first year there and they went to the Super Bowl. And I mentioned this to Mike and I want to reiterate this, it's nice to have that. It's nice to have someone like Joe Mixon, who's one of the few guys who's been around since the Marvin Lewis era, who's a 7-year vet. But you cannot let feelings come into this. It's a matter of, okay, this is a business. We want to win the Super Bowl now. We want to revolve around Joe Burrow. If it means cutting a guy loose that we really like, that's the NFL. It's one of the most cutthroat, I think, businesses in professional sports. But I just mentioned that because, whether or not you restructure guys like that, whether or not you keep guys like that, it doesn't just affect the Joe Burrow situation. It affects, okay, what can you spend in free agency on some positions? Where can you allocate resources in the draft? And where in the draft do you allocate them? Which leads to my next point about the offensive line. Andrew, I don't know if you know this, but if you look historically, at least in the last decade, not only has the Bengals offensive line struggled to find the continuity that it's dreaming of having like other championship teams, but if you zoom in a little further, right tackle has been miserable. I'm just going to give you some PFF numbers of the Bengals right tackles in the last 10 years. La'el Collins, barely about a 58. Last year, Riley Reef, before he had a season-ending injury, 67. Bobby Hart for the last 3 years before that was pretty much averaging a 57 to 65. Andre Smith, who I don't want to say was a bust, but wasn't what they wanted him to be, 55, 58, 60. Cedric Obegi, who I think was a bust, the Texas A&M first-round pick at right tackle, barely a 60. Neither of those guys have panned out. Some of those were draft picks like Smith and Obegi. A lot of those were free agents like La'el Collins and Riley Reef. I know we've talked a ton about La'el Collins, and I don't want to zoom in on him, but just in general, you look at it like this. The Bengals have just not been good at right tackle in the last decade. Just the numbers speak for it. We debated Collins' numbers on the podcast, and I think if you talk to any of the other guys who've covered this team long enough, like Paul Dana or Jay Morrison, they'd probably agree with me, at least from a right tackle perspective. I think with the offensive line, it's more nuanced, but at right tackle, they've struggled a lot. So zoom into the first round, 28th pick. I mean, if Peter Skoronski's gone, like if those big name tackles are gone, at that point, which I mean, they're gonna be. I mean, Paris Johnson, Broderick Jones. If you only have like a, Darnell Wright or, Anton Harrison left at that point, I mean, do you even entertain that? Like, do you risk picking someone like that and repeating history with Andre Smith and Cedric Obegi? Or do you maybe go the free agent route? And I'll kind of list out some names here. Like, do you go the free agent route and get guys like Jermaine Elamunor, Mike McGlinchey, Caleb McGarry, Kelvin Beachum? When you look at the history and where things stand now, what do you kind of make of all that, Andrew? What do you do?
Yeah, I don't think you can really look at the past, the past kind of success that they've had or lack of success that they've had drafting tackles. I'm not really sure that should matter. I do think that you kind of look at, some of the guys in free agency, and obviously McGlinchey kind of stands out. Like, if you can add a McGlinchey, I think that would be, I mean, that's a different conversation. I really wouldn't be very interested in Illuminor, or McGarry, those guys you just kind of mentioned. To me, this is if you're going to sign somebody in free agency, you're going to cut La'el Collins and you're going to replace him with another starter. And again, it's health. You don't know what he's going to be like. I still think you need to draft an offensive tackle in the draft, whether or not you sign McGlinchey or whatever you do at tackle. But you obviously, your needs change a little bit, and maybe you're not drafting one in round one. But I do believe that you can't really look at the past and say, we really haven't been good at this. So to me, if you like the guy that's there, if you like a player that you think can be an impact starter for you right from the get-go, I don't know how you look past that. So it's an interesting position for sure, and I am very curious how they do it, because again, you could very well have a nice situation build at 28 where you're sitting there and all of a sudden it's Anton Harrison and one of the tight ends, Washington, Kincaid, or Mayers on the board, and you've got a really difficult decision to make.
I think, and I love saying this, and I'm going to keep saying this until draft day, the beauty and the struggle of the offseason is, and Mike will laugh when I say this, you don't know until you know. We don't know a lot right now because we're still not in free agency. That's a good, week and a half away, a little under 2 weeks basically. And then I think once we get through that, it's going to make some clarity as to, okay, which position seems more important at the 28th overall pick? Why does that seem more important? And who are some names that come out of that? But I think if we're just talking right now based on how the combine is going and just, where the Bengals are at, from what Duke Tobin and Zach Taylor said, it's still really hard. I think we know more clarity on the Joe Burrow situation and, where guys like T. Higgins are a priority and, maybe the Joe Mixons and the Hayden Hurst and the Logan Wilsons are kind of not an afterthought, but they're more secondary to those guys. But I just think, when you think about, like Jonah Williams is going to be a free agent after next year. Hakeem Adeniji is going to be a free agent. You don't really know what the future is for Jackson Carman. I mean, I think he proved himself a little bit at tackle. I think he needs an offseason and a training camp to make more of a case for maybe starting for La'el Collins if he's not ready, at the beginning of the year. And that's something that Frank Pollock said he'd kind of have to see. He didn't want to jump to any conclusions because, he hasn't really seen Carman in training camp yet because that's still, months away. But it's tough. And I think with the Bengals, you got to feel frustrated, because you haven't had success at right tackle. You've had failure after failure after failure in the draft and free agency. And I think, if you really think about it, Andrew, we've said it over and over again, but I'm going to say it to echo the frustration. Your offensive line is what kept you from possibly winning back-to-back Super Bowls. It's what kept them from winning it in 2021 when they were in the big game. It's what kept them from getting back and maybe having a shot at the Eagles. I don't want to open that can of worms up. But the point is, that's how close they were. And so that's where the offensive line talk's not going anywhere, but you think about it in respect to the other positions and the 28th overall pick. And it's a position that I think, to kind of put a bow on that, this is something you don't want to screw up. The Bengals know they are not winning a championship without an offensive line. I understand you're going to have some drop-off in other areas like linebacker, safety without Pratt and Bates, but you need that offensive line. If you don't have that, I don't care if Joe Burrow is going to be the preseason favorite MVP. They don't care about Burrow winning MVP. They care about Burrow winning Super Bowl MVP. And so that's where I think the offensive line becomes so important. But I want to kind of switch it to your side a little bit because I want to have some fun with this. Mike wasn't so big on this because, he's not as into, the AFC North and the Ravens like you, for example. But fittingly, I want to ask you this. We saw the Rashad Bateman tweet, which he since deleted, where he called out Eric DeCosta, the Ravens general manager, when, DeCosta said, if we couldn't find better receivers, I couldn't tell you why. And Bateman, just to paraphrase his words, said, why do you point the finger at us in number 8? A.k.a. Lamar Jackson. And then you look at the fact that Lamar Jackson's not on a contract. He may not be a Raven next year, among other things. I mean, what is going on in Baltimore, Andrew? Are we overreacting, or is crap hitting the fan in B-more right now?
Yeah, they're so it was interesting. So I thought I still haven't read it. So sorry, Jimmy. But Jimmy Watkins for us, he was there. He was at that press conference, and he wrote a good story about it, or at least so I'm told. At least that Jimmy told me. I asked him about it, when we were at dinner yesterday, and he kind of told me that this was very clearly a situation where the whole context was not out there. That was one of the reasons why, that people kind of blew up about it, and specifically Rashad Bateman. And, you saw Hollywood Brown chime in too. He's like, but John Harbaugh said, people forget about how good Rashad Bateman is. So I think that, that was one of those situations where it was kind of a bit of a lost in translation. But again, we've said this for a while, the Ravens need receiver talent. And you think back to some of the best receivers that they've had over the years. How many times have the Bengals been scared of what the Ravens have thrown out in the passing game from a receiver? I mean, you got Mark Andrews, yeah, but Torrey Smith they drafted. Okay, Torrey Smith is probably the best receiver they've drafted in the last handful of years because, I mean, Anquan Bolden they acquired in a trade. Steve Smith they acquired in a trade. They've gone after guys through the free agency or the trade market to try and get them. So, to me, I don't think DeCosta is wrong. I would have phrased it a little more carefully if I was him. But again, I think it was just one of those things where Bateman kind of took offense to it, not really seeing the whole context of everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's the world we live in with social media, right? Is you see one thing and you hear another, and people like to overblow it and overreact. So I think that's a perfect case example of that. But to kind of tie it back to Cincinnati, I mean, if you're in a situation where you don't have Lamar Jackson, or you do have him, but he just doesn't have good wide receivers for whatever reason, to go back to what you talked about, I mean, with respect to Pittsburgh and Cleveland, I mean, does that mean that the Ravens aren't going to be heavy hitting, in the AFC North next year, or does this really not mean much as far as what John Harbaugh is capable of putting together, of maybe getting a division win or, taking the Ravens back to the playoffs?
Yeah, I think the Ravens are going to be really good next year again. I think they were kind of on path to win and on track to win the AFC North before the Bengals took off, and frankly, the Ravens all got hurt again. So, to me, I think that you look at the AFC North, it's certainly the deepest division in the sport. I mean, the Browns, Deshaun Watson, the Steelers, Kenny Pickett. And I'm not a Pickett guy, but when he's, I think, the worst quarterback in the division, that's saying something. So it's going to be a really, really tough division. And, I think it was very clear in kind of watching that playoff game with the Bengals and the Ravens. I remember we were saying this in the press box, man, their number one receiver right now is Demarcus Robinson. If you can add a number one, Ravens might be cooking with gas. So I think if Bateman gets healthy and you can add a guy or two in the draft or free agency or whatever that can come in and kind of make some plays for you, it's going to be a really, really interesting season next year in the AFC North.
Yeah, I mean, the AFC North never has a drop off. It's not had a drop off in the last 10 years. I mean, if you disagree with me, to those listening, I mean, how does a team like the Bengals go from 4-11-1 the same year that the Browns, Steelers, and Ravens all made the playoffs, to going to the Super Bowl the next year. I mean, that's just how crazy this division is. One team drops, the other one rises, and vice versa. I think if the Browns were bad one year, they would have been better the next. I mean, who knows? Cleveland with Deshaun Watson, I mean, I don't know, man. Like, they still got some weapons. They got Deshaun Watson. They got Nick Chubb. Like, I like to see what they do in their secondary because they're getting rid of John Johnson, and who knows if Jesse Bates goes there. I want to talk to Dan Labby about that later when we get closer to free agency, which kind of reminds me. So, I don't know. I mean, it's just – I didn't mean to get off topic there, but, like, this kind of time of the year with the offseason shows you, like, just how loaded, these teams are in the AFC North and how it's just a rat race. And so exciting but crazy to see. But to kind of wrap up, I didn't really talk about these numbers, but, we saw Nolan Smith yesterday. I kind of went through his numbers. I think that kid is a freak, and I will shoot myself in the foot, not literally, but I might shoot myself in the foot if he's not a first-round pick because he was ridiculously filthy yesterday. If you can't tell, I'm passionate about it. But, there's some sleeper guys, I think, who are on the defensive, line, tackle, and edge rusher who showed out. One name that sticks out to me is Yaya Diaby, defensive end from Louisville. Most boards had him projected as like a backup / special teamer to get, picked, in the 4th or 5th round, kind of like a Khalid Kareem. That's an example that ties with the Bengals. He's not there anymore, but Khalid Kareem was a 5th round pick out of Notre Dame. When I see Yaya Diaby, he kind of reminds me of him. 37-inch vertical, 4th best among defensive ends. And then you look at his 40 time, he ran a 4.5. The fastest 40 time of any active Bengal on the defensive line is Joseph Osai, 4.63. Which is why I still can't understand why he fell to the 3rd round, but good for the Bengals, I guess. But, yeah, this kid ran a 4.5. His vertical is one of the best amongst his position group. I don't know that he's going to be much higher than a 3rd-round pick, but, I mean, you look at Yaya Diaby. You look at Isaiah McGuire from Missouri, guys like that who put up similar numbers, Will McDonald from Iowa State. To kind of just put a bow on this, Andrew, before we kind of pick up the Combine talk next week once the weekend is wrapped up, what do you think of some of the edge rushers? You watched them yesterday, so you know about Diaby and McDonald and these guys. What impressed you from watching the prospects yesterday, and what does that mean for some guys that could fit with the Bengals?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you mean watching them and on the on-field stuff is kind of hard to kind of get a grip for. I think, one of the guys that stood out to me yesterday was Andre Carter, just because I'm fascinated by him and his story, but also kind of what his potential is. You're talking about a guy who's 6'7", 260. He's coming out of Army. He's set to be the highest draft pick there for I think since like 1947. He's a really solid football player. Teams have really kind of had to mark him, and you saw his numbers go down this year. But that's kind of why he was getting double and triple teamed. So I think if you can kind of tap into that, that's a guy who I'd be looking at. Maybe not at 28, maybe towards, maybe you move back a little bit and you take that guy. But, that's somebody who I think is really interesting.
Yeah, rightfully so. And I knew you were in Indy yesterday because, like I said earlier in the podcast, you're the cool kid. I'm not as cool as you. That's why they hired you first before me. No, I'm just kidding. But in all seriousness, I know you had some interesting observations there, so I'm glad you shared that. And I think we'll talk more about that next week when Mike joins us because, you've got the tight ends, the quarterbacks, the wide receivers, working out later this weekend, running backs as well. And I know we didn't talk about that as much, but I want to kind of talk more about that later because we still don't know what running back is going to mean with respect to the Bengals just based on what happens to Joe Mixon. But we'll talk about those results next week, if maybe the Bengals should start entertaining those options regardless of what happens to Joe Mixon. And we'll also look at some other performers from today. As we're talking right now, the cornerbacks and special teamers, a.k.a. kickers and punters, are working out. So we don't really have any lifetime stats for you, so we'll talk about those on Monday when we get back at it. But we hope you enjoy your weekend. We hope you enjoyed an exciting week of Combine football. It's far from over. Join us Monday as we bring a bow to everything and look ahead to free agency. Once again, for myself and Andrew Gillis, I'm Muhammad Ahmad. We'll see you Monday. Enjoy your weekend. And if you're in the Midwest, stay dry and stay safe.